Okay, so I've got my project loaded up just to refresh myself how things are at this point. We were getting to the point of retrieving the data from the database to display on screen. So I'm going to go through the process here just to run it in the simulator, to set up an account, to confirm that it works as we left it last time. So I'm going to open up the console. Just going to create an account because it's a brand new session, so I need a user with v@v.com, simple password, someone's at the front door, v@v.com. I'm going to sign in on that, and okay. Saving a comic. We got that part working, definitely saving a comic. So I'm going to save Spider-Man 1, 1963, actually 1991, Marvel First Todd McFarlane issue. Okay, so I'm saving that comic. Saved. Stuff got saved over on View Comics. This is where we last left off, that, okay, we're saving stuff to the database, and we started to get our show comics function to start to do its thing. And so far, as you've seen here, I've got one thing in my database to retrieve. That is a simple output that says we've got one object, and I can confirm that in the application, viewer, IndexedDB. This current user has their own account, v@v.com. If I look at my data by sequence, I've added one thing so far to my database. Now, I got to triple check my code, but I believe I've got some little bug here that I've got to fix. It looks like I'm not properly saving the publisher information. I probably missed something somewhere. Just checking with you guys if you can check this. If you save a comic and you save also something in the publisher, and then check in the app viewer, yours probably works, right? Is it just me that I did something wrong, or can we check with yours? I'm supposed to see notes, number, title, year, publisher, which you saw that I typed it in, but I didn't seem to save it, so I have to check my code. Just checking with you guys if you can just check that to confirm. Do you see a publisher field? Well, nothing's going to appear on screen in View Comic. I want you to check in the application screen of the console, and then check in the particular database that you've got for your user by sequence, and then check that you've got a field of publisher in the viewer. So you do see it. You have one hand. At least one hand. Anyone else also that you see it? You see it too, okay? Well, it's just a call to anyone that can answer, but it's application viewer, but then by sequence, do you see your publisher field? At least two people say that they see it. So, okay, there's something with mine that I just have to triple check my code. I'm sure that when I put the data together in a JSON object, somehow maybe I missed a comma or something. Some people see it, and I don't. So I'll check that code later. This is not catastrophic at the moment, but I'll check it later to see why I'm missing that field. If we've got a field for publisher, obviously I want to save that data. For some reason, mine's not saving, but we'll figure it out a little later. Question? Yeah, if it's not there, that's the problem. That I'm not. You do see it on yours. Okay, good. Mine's missing, so I've got to check my code. Where did I miss that? But I'll get back to that later. Let's talk about starting to display this stuff on screen. The idea here is that this table will populate dynamically for as many comics as I've saved. I will have a row for that comic, plus its number, and then a button for details. I click the button, and then a pop-up happens for the details. The year, the publisher, the notes. So that's where we last left off. We want to pull the data from the database to start to display it on screen.
There was a misspelling for the publisher.
What line might that be at? What line are you looking at that I might have missed it?
For me, it's 247.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick look at 247-ish. Is it when we put together the JSON data, or like what kind of area nearby?
Oh, for me it was misspelling the HTML, like the ID.
So in the HTML file, line 247?
For me at least it was published.
Yeah, let me check a little bit later just to confirm all of that. So, moving on here, what I want to do is the last thing, the last code that we wrote at near the end. Yes?
We still have to make another copy of everything in the database, but it's not taking like 5 minutes to...
Well, it's not the database that takes a while to copy. It's your whole folder.
Yeah.
Everything in the folder, when you copy that folder, it is a lot of things, so that's why as soon as you walk in the door, you've got to make a copy.
Okay, that works. I didn't know if it was still... That was just still standard operating procedure.
Yeah, I would still recommend that. Make a copy of your work just to have a backup, just in case.
Yeah. Okay.
Question?
The for the on the collections page where you have the table data, is that information that was in the JavaScript, or is that something that's supposed to be in the HTML?
That happens dynamically in the JavaScript. You see here on line 511, I've got let's build a table, and then I've got let's show the table. So it's the JavaScript that's creating that little table, which is not complete yet. So you're not going to see the table in the HTML. It's dynamically generated.
But the thing is, when you view it on your screen, you're seeing table information, and I still have comments go here.
Okay, so that is that issue that if maybe you're missing this final line right here, which is let's build a table, but then let's actually write it as HTML on screen.
I have that.
Okay, well, let me proceed with my thoughts at the moment, and then we'll figure out what's going on by not displaying it in just a moment. Question?
I don't know if the time for it, but I was going to say, if you wanted to run through your troubleshooting to figure out why the publisher wasn't showing the way.
I'm not getting any troubleshooting info. I'm not getting any feedback in the console that'll help me figure that out. If I was getting some errors, that would help me figure out what's going on, but you know, I'll do it a little bit later once I figure out I probably misspelled something, and it's probably an ID, which might not give an error, so it might be a little bit more than just checking the console, which I have not seen any issues in the console, so it's probably more of a logic error than a syntax error.
Okay, so you'd probably look for more, I don't know.
I'd have to kind of like go back through the process of like where it should appear here. Let me look at that code. Then that comes from this code. Let me look at that code. So I'll probably have to backtrack a little bit, but I don't want to just get to that just yet because my project works. It just doesn't display the publisher, which I'll work on that a little bit later. Okay, so what we've got is the two functions in question that matter at the moment at approximately line 502 or so. This is the end of my comics function show comics prep. This is the function that prepares the comics to be displayed on screen. It will then pass that information over to the next function. So I believe that's where we were at.
Show comments table.
So where I last left it, we put in temporarily function show comics prep inside a function show comics table, and I have the note there, quick test to see if we can retrieve the comics. It was just a test, so I'm actually going to comment that out. In your function show comics table, we've got show comics prep. Comment that out because it's not quite ready yet. We are still preparing the comics data a little bit. So this calling of this function, which is not quite ready yet, we just left it there at the end of the day last time just to kind of see is it kind of working. And I confirmed that it was, so to continue it to work, in the comics prep, so I'll back up to where comics prep is happening, I've got a line that says console log success.rows. That was a quick way to display comics in the console as an object. If I was getting in the console output that was showing comics, the function was behaving as expected so far. Success.rows is, okay, success is the object that has all of the comics to display on screen. And then .rows, well, there's a property of each of the rows of the comics. I've got one comic so far, so there's only one row at index 0. Once I've got 2 comics, we have index 0, index 1. Once we've got 3 comics, it's 0, 1, 2, and so forth. So we have these rows of comics. We want to pass this data, success.rows, we want to pass the actual comic data into the function that makes the table. It's expecting data. It's expecting for us to pass the rows of comics into this function so that it can finally display it on screen. So backing up on our prep comics, this assumes that I've got comics to show on screen. If I run this for the very first time, I have no comics. Therefore, that table would look weird with nothing in it. So we'll have instead conditional statement to confirm there's comic data. To display on screen before passing the data to function show comics table function. Before we try to pass data into this function is expecting data to work with. If there's no data, there might be trouble. It expects data, there's no data. So we might get errors and so forth. But it's also good for setting this up for the user. Again, the very first time they load up our app and they're just kind of exploring and going to the different screens, and they go to the screen view comics, there's no comics. We want to make sure that we account for that, so we'll have a conditional statement in case there's no comic data. We have an if-else. If there's data, do something. If there isn't data, do something else. Success.rows, R-O-W-S, not rows, like the flower, rows. Brackets 0 equals undefined. Okay, so we're checking. Let's check. To check if there's the 0th entry, the first entry. Remember, we count from 0. Let's check if there's data in the very first row of comics. If instead the system gives back undefined, there's no comics. There have not been comics saved yet. So this first block is confirming there's no comics. The second block, the else, is there is comics. So we'll say console log, no comics to display yet. Versus there are comics to display. So this final conditional statement to check on the condition of no data versus the condition of there is data is one step before we finally pass the data to this function, which is in charge of displaying it on screen.
What would happen if instead of else you would then? Instead of if else you would use if then?
Then isn't used, to my knowledge, then isn't used in this case for JavaScript. Other languages use if-then, but not JavaScript. They use if-else. We have then in another way using something called promises, which is something else, but the basic syntax is if-else.
If you couldn't use it through writing what then or else means, can't you essentially?
If you're saying we would define what then means, is that what you mean?
What
Well, that's like saying, okay, if cat, that's not a real command. Then is not a real command in this case. So
Well, I'm saying like if we call it else, can it still do the exact same thing as if it was then? I mean, what is the difference really?
the difference is that then doesn't exist. It's if else. If it was if then, and there was an equivalent, then we would choose either one. But it's if else in JavaScript. It might be if then in other languages. So let's write a message on screen. We've got the $L div show comics table. We can write some HTML there. Now, we've got already in the HTML file our placeholder, our div show comics placeholder, and we already hard-coded a value in there in the HTML file saying something. There's no comics yet, whatever we wrote. This is kind of doing the same thing. The reason I'm showing it again is, again, because of the power of JavaScript, that we have the ability to dynamically read and write and change HTML. So I will say no comics yet, save some. What I'm showing here is you have the power to write HTML in the HTML document that doesn't already exist. We're using the HTML, the .html method of jQuery to write HTML in any place we want in the HTML file. What we need is something in the HTML file that has, uniquely identified either class or ID. So anything that we write in the quotes right here will be processed as HTML. So don't write this, but if we wanted to write H1, no comics. This is not quite valid, but if we wanted to write actual HTML code, we could write HTML code here. This method will process it and put it into this div on screen. And again, you wouldn't really put it like this because it'll break it no on one line and then comics yet on the next line. So I'm just showing as the example. If I did M for emphasis, okay, that's a little bit more, makes more sense. It'll be emphasized. It'll be italicized. So the point of this is you can write any valid HTML in the quotes when we're saying, let's write some HTML somewhere. Okay, so that's what we're doing in the undefined. The only way you'll see that is the first time that you run your app when you've never saved a comic. Well, you've never saved a comic. Success rows is going to be undefined. There are no comics to display. So that would be one of the times that you would see that message on screen. You can go in and delete your database, and then try to run it, and then see that message. But normally that would only be visible the time that no comics have ever been saved. In the else, okay, or else there must be comics. If we're checking, check the first comic, and if it's not undefined, there must be something. Even if it's misspelled, it's lowercase, it's half written or whatever, instead of The Amazing Spider-Man, they just write The Amazing. There's been something that's been saved in the database, so then else happens. There are comics to display. In the console, let's tell ourselves there are 2 comics to display. There are 12 comics to display. Let's tell ourselves in the console how many comics should be displayed so that later on we can corroborate that, yeah, all 7 got displayed. There are success.rows.length comics to display. There is the property of length, which will give you how many things are there in this array. Ultimately, the data is in rows, like in an array, sequentially, because we requested it alphabetically. And so there's a length property of an array. This will tell you there's 3, there's 12, there's 90 comics. So it'll say there are 90 comics to display, in theory. Does this code look good to you? Should we proceed? No, why? It's just a string.
Yeah, the single quotes around that success.rows.length.
It may or may not be single quotes, but we need quotes. But the point is that, yes, this is all a string, so it will literally say in the console, there are success.rows.length comics to display. It won't say there are 90. It won't say there are 2. It won't actually be dynamic, because all of this is a string. What we need are, there are end quote plus JavaScript plus open quote HTML comics to display. So in the console, we're going to write some static string data. This is going to stay like, I'll probably put a space there actually, or else it will not. Oops, too many pluses. Sorry about that. There we go. There are space 2 comics to display. This will be processed dynamically as JavaScript, so we have to end the string, continue to add to it, concatenation. We've written some string stuff, and then some JavaScript stuff, and then some HTML stuff again. That's what's going on there. I'm not going to worry about the grammar of it when there's one comic. There are 1 comics to display. It's just a console. I'm not going to worry about it. If it was going to display on screen, yes, I'd have to write then conditional statements to deal with, well, what if we've got 1 comic versus, multiple comics? This is just a console. It's fine. But in the console, I'm going to say here dynamically there are X comics to display. And then pass the data over to the other function. So function show comics table success dot rows when we had at the top of my screen there DB all docs, give me all the comics is what that's saying. If we successfully retrieve the comics, it gives us the comics back to us as success.rows. The comics are right there. So let's run the function show comics table and pass to it the data of comics. This is what that function expects. We're going to pass data into it to display it on screen. So now we've handed the data off from this function that was preparing it. In a sense, we've passed it over to the other function, which now it will take over to display it. I'm also going to write a note here because I'm going to forget. Note, use fn show comics prep instead of fn show comics table. We've been to sort of like beta test this or alpha test this. To test this as we're working, we've used the show comics table function as a way to just let's see if it works. But logically, we want to prepare the data before we show the data. When we started to set up our code last week about showing the data, we jumped straight to let's show the data. We needed to prepare the data first. So we were just, as a placeholder, somewhere else in our code, we were running show comics table. We're going to need to replace that with show comics prep instead of table. We need to prepare the data, then show it. So I'm putting that note there because I'm going to forget. We've retrieved the data. We're passing it over to table here. Okay, this line over here, we create this string, this table. We're about to create a table. We built a table with a single 1 pixel border around it. We've got 1 row so far with a title, a number, and details. The next row is then going to be my first comic. Then the next row is the next comic, and so forth. This is the part now where we will break apart this this code here, we're going to break it apart over here, but we have to do it by ending the quote plus continuing the quote. We can't just press enter and move it to the next line, because we started to build our table. We built the first row. I want a new row, next line. It's kind of getting cut off, but just a moment. Let me zoom in right here. Okay, so it's going to look a little bit messy for a moment, and then I'll explain it. So we started to build the whole table. We had one row for the headings. And then I'm going to build another row. And then we're going to end the table. And then eventually display the table on screen. A regular row, instead of having headings, these column headings, I've got a title, a number, and a details. Instead of THs, instead of table headings, we have regular table cells, table data. So we have a TD, just put A for the moment. We have another cell, B. And then we have the third cell for the third column, C. Just putting quick placeholders here. But maybe if I line them up like this, they might be, oops, if I line them up like this, it might make sense. We've got our first row of headings. First heading cell, second heading cell, third heading cell. End of the row. Next line, a new row, a new cell. Okay, this cell lines up with that column. This cell lines up with that column, and this cell lines up with that column, and then the next one and the next one. So this is going to be a new row, ending the table. At the moment, it's not dynamic, but I want to confirm this is working. And I want to fix what I've got here. Show comics prep instead of show comics table. I want to fix that before we go too much further, and I'll do that in a moment. Here's my function show comics table coming together. With the data I've passed from the previous function, I'm going to use it in a moment. I'm starting to craft further my table so it dynamically creates rows for each comic. And let's see, where do we have instances of that? Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. Line 440, this is near the end of our save comic. It's going to happen in a few places, but one of the places so far, remember as we were testing it, we were going to save a comic, and then we were going to go to view comic, and we were going to start to see that simple table. My note, I said, well, we're not going to use that function anymore. We're going to use the prep function. We're going to use the function that prepares the data, which then passes it to the table function to display it. So instead of function show comics table, change that to function show comics table prep. After saving, prep the data to display on screen. The purpose of prep comic function is to look in the database, to retrieve the comics in the database, and then pass it over to the show comics table function. So when it passes over, then it displays. Okay, I believe we should be able to check it at this point. me pull up both of these places at the same time just to show two things here. Up on our save comic, we've got show comics prep, and then the code that we wrote just a moment ago. To this table, try saving it and running it at that point. Save a comic, then go to view comic. It won't show the full comic data just yet, but you should see a table that now has 2 rows, and the second row should say A, A, B, B, and such. Okay, so I'll do help in a moment, but the idea is now you should start to see 2 rows. We had the first row, which was just headings, and we saw we made the second row ABC. I've saved 2 comics so far, so this tells me there are 2 comics to display, and then the table is running. So, successfully saved, where is it up here? Up there. We successfully saved 1 comic. I saved 1 comic right now. Then that kicks off running prep comics, which then starts to retrieve comics from the database. 2 comics so far. There are 2 comics, and the table's not dynamic yet. But then the function that's going to make the table starts running. So that's what you should see at this point here. Here's the code so far. We'll do some quick check here that it works. Anyone having any trouble? Couple people. Okay, be there. Well, it wasn't showing until you said it. So right now you just said it. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But if you started your app and you went directly to view, you wouldn't see it. You had to still try to save it on it, even though it wasn't ready up to this point yet before that works. Those dots are files that come from the Mac. So the Mac puts some files internally behind the scenes. So I don't really worry about it because it's over on this other file, so I don't really worry about it just yet. That's just the assumptions. These copies in the background that the Mac creates.
I didn't actually put it in, still exists.
Creative perhaps some sort of intent loop.
Just excited.
Yeah, so that's just, so you're good as long as you can see the table.
No, because it's incremental.
Yeah.
It should cause eventually it to crash.
Yes.
Which should show comics. That show comics prep is under save comic. This is not save comic. This is save comics table. So you did put it up here.
Okay, so you both have the same code, or is that okay?
Okay, so I deleted something.
Let's see.
Because we commented out, it doesn't matter. You deleted it. So in that time, something else. So it doesn't matter what that is. Try to run that because that's what's causing the just running the.
She's just outputting the array, which is the table, and you're not. But they both work. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. Yes. It's running.
That doesn't work
Yeah.
until you see the context. Okay.
I'm trying to capture the, is it more than one?
That's what you see so far, so, it's going so far. It's good so far, you just add it to it.
Oh, yes.
This is what and so we have this here. So what we wanted, instead of it just simply showing that we wanted to run the function then over here we run the function. This part here, this is the part that you're not doing the double function. So now we're running the same function. So the same function.
Quick question for you. I'm not asking, not this, but the actual version.
You say any comment?
Yeah.
It's under index.
I had added.
Those storage is only for you.
Oh, I have to open it. Okay. Thank you. That was what I was thinking. That's what I was, I realized that you do that more. Thank you.
My dad is actually saying Windows 7. So I'm like, let's try this again. But I'm calling you for, I want to get it anyway. 'Cause I think project manager. Just kind of want myself on back to
That's pointing towards the arrow.
just in case I need it for cross development.
Success object unknown because we're referring to the success of the end of life. Okay, so if you're seeing this placeholder information about the comic, obviously it's not dynamically updating itself. It is saying A, B, C. We need that to dynamically update. We'll do it with one example, and then we have to write a little algorithm so that it does it multiple times. Because right now we'll hard code it in a way that we can confirm one comic will display, but then we have to code it in a way that multiple comics display. Okay, this is the part that's going to be familiar to when we had to do this dynamic data. So we have to say, data and brackets 0 dot title data brackets 0 dot number. We've got this table that is going to display only a title and a number, and then when they click a details, it'll display the rest. But here I'm saying, okay, I'm referring to the data in my database as data. Because up here, when I created function show comics table, it says we expect to get something put into this function, and we're going to call it data. Well, we're passing into it right above up here at the very top. We're running the function, and we're passing into it data called whatever, and we're calling it data when we use it in here, success.rows. So we're passing it in here. We're saying data of the 0th position, so the first comic. And every comic has a title, a year, a number, etc. Publisher, etc. So we're saying in this cell, for the 0th comic, the first comic, show the title. In this cell, for the 0th comic, show the number. Well, we get into the same issue that we had previously about this is not dynamic. This is in the quotes. It's a string, so it will literally write in the cell data brackets 0 dot title and then data brackets 0 dot number. We need to make this dynamic. So let me do it first, and then we'll do it together. It's a lot of opening and closing quotes. I'm going to open the quote or close the quote there, plus JavaScript, and then plus continue HTML. Right? See the logic of that? We're going to write some HTML that will never change, and then we're going to write some JavaScript that will change dynamically, and then HTML, and then JavaScript, and then HTML again. So I'm going to end the quote again right over here, and then concatenation, add some JavaScript, basically. So write some HTML, and then some JavaScript, and then HTML, and then JavaScript, and then HTML. So one more plus end quotes. Actually, not right there, yes. Right there, yes, good point. Right here. There it is. So the error goes away. So, yep. So HTML, this stuff, we have to create the row and then one cell, okay? The cell starts and ends here, and in between is the dynamic data. Then we start the next cell, and it ends right here, and then that number. The third one, C, we'll deal with that one in a moment. But this is enough for you to save it and run it. Save a comic, and then you will see a real title and a real number for your first comic, the one you did earlier. Obviously, if I want to then display the third comic, 0, 1, 2, 3, that's going to be a number 4, right? You're going to have the different, you're going to change that. Right now it's not dynamic yet, but I want to see at least that it is displaying my 0th comic, the one at position 0, the one that I first saved when I ran my app. This would be, I think, the third time that we do, or third or fourth time that we do something like this, where we have to open and close the string and then add more dynamic JavaScript and build a string. We'll figure out about elegantly breaking up our string in a moment, but I want to see this result. So I'm going to run it. We'll zoom in again in just a moment. I want to confirm my code here. All right, let me confirm mine. Okay, yes, it will be undefined, but just to have it actually display. So let me just write something. Save that, view that. Okay, we're getting undefined. That's fine. I missed one thing. But what's happening here now, it's trying to dynamically change. It's trying to display the title and the number of a particular comic, my 0th comic. So it's no longer ABC. It's going to dynamically change. C is still C because we haven't done that one. But here's what I missed here. We have to say data 0 .doc and then title. There's one more sub-property here I forgot. So both of these need a doc. PouchDB is storing these things in a very specific way. Once you know how it works, then it's easy to work with. But we've got the 0th comic. There is a document at that position. And we invented title, property, number, property, publisher, property, etc. We just have to have like the main object, what position, and then we have to have doc, that's built in. I'll show you where that's coming from in a moment. And then the particular fields or properties that we invented. Try that again. That should display the real info. you broke your code somewhere else, so check your error list, and when the code breaks, it keeps you in the welcome screen. So we'll check you in a moment. I'm about to save something else. Save that, view that. So there's that comic right there. So I've started to save these items in my database because it's putting it alphabetically, and I'm just putting gibberish here. Okay, comic 434 it comes before comic ASD, comes before comic Spider-Man, comes before comic ZZ. So the first thing it's showing me is that comic. It just so happens to be the last one that I wrote, just because alphabetically. Okay, if I put in comic 00, save that, save comic view comic, it's showing me comic 0. Obviously, if I save comic Zorro, it's not Zorro, it's not going to display Zorro because it retrieves the data alphabetically, not sequentially. So that should make sense. Here I've saved 6 comics so far. Again, it retrieved it in alphabetical order. That was all docs ascending true. And so I wrote comic 43 and 00. I just wrote Zorro, and there it is. It's the second to my final comic alphabetically. My code is still saying display comic 0. There it is, comic 0. If you're curious, I hope then you say, what if I do brackets 2? Right? Because we have 0, 1, 2. That should confirm then. It'll display the title and the number of comic position 2, 0, 1, 2. So inside we have data brackets 0. There it is. This is all of the data, brackets 0. Inside of that object, we then have the property doc. There's the doc. Then we have the dot title, or the dot number, or the dot year, notes, and publisher when I fix that. So that's the logic of how do we actually make it display something? Well, we're saying here, position 0 of our data. There was the doc property, and then the ones that we made up. So this doesn't make sense, but what if I write here, year? Into that cell, write the year of this document at position 0. Or what if I'm saying, at position 3, in my case, document title. Again, it won't match up with the columns because I'm just throwing stuff in here. And now I'm saying at position 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, fourth comic, display the title in that cell. It doesn't line up logically with the name of the column, but I'm just showing you what happens there. And so this is how we're going to dynamically be able to display the particular item from a particular position. So put it back.
When says identifier expected, having it's only keeping me in the welcome page.
There's going to be some sort of error in your code that you wrote recently, so we'll do help in a moment. Instead of CCC, we're going to put an icon here for people to click on. So we can write icons by using their character entity code, $, £, X, number 1, capital F. There is an icon here that we're accessing. Oops. F4, then AC. Semicolon. We are accessing an icon here, $, okay, so £, ampersand, £, X, 1, F, F4AC. This will display as an icon on screen. There's a certain icon. We can look up a list of all of these icons. They're like these emoji icons. Behind the scenes, they all have a little character code. This one's going to be like a little speech bubble. So I'm not going to do the quotes trick. I want the same icon to appear on each of those rows. There's going to be a row of the first comic, Amazing Spider-Man, and then B, Batman, and C, Catwoman. I want on each row the same icon at the end. We're then going to program, okay, I press the icon and it pops up to show me the details of Batman. I press the other icon, it pops up the details of Catwoman. So that's just going to generate an icon. It has to be typed just the right way. Don't forget all of the things here. Ampersand, pound sign, X, and then 1F4AC, ampersand, semicolon.
Can we make it centered?
We will get to some styling, yes.
And what is this supposed to be? It's a little, like,
It creates a little icon. When you save it and run it, it should create an icon at the end of the row.
Start the table data around the.
It was already there. We already had a table data right there. Remember, we had ABC, and so we had the third cell of C. I just replaced CCC with this.
Oh,
Okay, so that code will then be converted to this icon. We want to center it and do all this cool stuff. We'll get to that visually. But the theory is, if this is Batman #1, I want to click on that so it pops up and displays all the details I've written for that particular entry. The title, the year, the number, the notes, the publisher, the photo, the barcode, etc. Because I'm not going to display all of that data in this table. It's going to get very cluttered. So eventually this will be clickable so that it pops up to display more info. We're going to set up something at the moment here to prepare ourselves for that eventually. We're going to give this a class. We need this to have a unique identifier. Well, IDs are something we've used before when one thing in all of our project needed to be identified. Well, we had used a class to identify the footers of our 3 screens. Those 3 screens were going to change the same way, so we used a class instead of an ID. An ID can only be used for one thing at a time per document. A class can be used multiple times. Same idea here. I'm going to have 12 rows of comics, and each one is going to have that little icon. But each one will have to be unique to identify a particular comic. So we'll give this a class. And single quotes right here, very important, because if you do the double quotes, that'll break the parent string that you started right here. We'll call this ETN show comics info. Eventually we will create a JavaScript object representing that, so that then we can click the icon, it'll show us more comics info. We're not there yet. But we are setting up something for the future. If we didn't do it now, we'd have to do it later, but you see the logic of it. We need to click that button so that it opens up for that particular comic. Well, it needs an identifier. An ID won't work. We need a class because we have more than one of those icons. And then we'll write code so that it knows which of those do we mean a little later. So nothing will really change on screen, but we'll do our break in a moment. All that it should do at this point is, now again, logically here, if I go directly to view comics, the table doesn't appear, it broke, what did I do wrong? Nothing. The table is not created until the function runs. We've programmed it that function doesn't run until a comic is saved. You know, that function doesn't trigger until this function is run, and this function is run at the moment only when we save a comic. When we save a comic, run the function to prep a comic to display. But if we go directly to view comics, nothing happens. We'll have to fix that, of course. But if you go to your code and nothing is happening just yet, on here, okay, save a comic. That's the only time that that actually runs. Save that. And I'm seeing, of course, in my code, yeah, now we're running those functions. So at that moment then, it starts to create the table. That's what our table is so far. The first comic. In my case, the first real comic, because I put a lot of gibberish, is 3. So I'm going to change it in my case. You can do this if you want or not. I'm going to put mine to 3 so I see something that makes sense. Right here. Instead of data 0 at position 3, in my case, I don't know what yours is. In my case, I've got 3, position 3, there is a real title, and at position 3, there is a real number. Actually, because if I add a comic before that, that's alphabetical. Okay, I'll add a comic at the end.
That's why before you'll be off.
Yeah, exactly. But there it is. So I added a comic after that position alphabetically. So now it shows something real. Issue number 99. Oh, I would love to center that table. I would like to change colors. We'll get to that. Right now we're just making sure that it works. And then eventually I click that icon and we'll get a pop-up with more data. We're not there yet. But at the very least, this is the kind of output that I'm getting, that I've got 9 comics saved. The table's starting to come together. I want all 9 to show up. That'll be the algorithm that comes next after the break. No errors so far. That's a good point to take a little break. When we come back at 7:22, we'll go on and keep it working.